But Mayor Pete made his announcement yesterday in an old factory. The rain was coming through the roofs. Everybody was wet and cold. And he took on Trump's promise to make America great again.
And that's why I'm here today, to tell a different story than Make America Great Again. Because there's a myth being sold to industrial and rural communities. The myth that we can stop the clock and turn it back. It comes from people who think the only way to speak to communities like ours is through resentment and nostalgia. They're selling an impossible promise of returning to a bygone era that was never as great as advertised to begin with. The problem is that they're telling us to look for greatness in all the wrong places. I recognize the audacity of doing this as a Midwestern millennial mayor. More than a little bold, at age 37, to seek the highest office in the land. Up until recently, this was not exactly what I had in mind either, for how I was going to spend my 8th year as mayor and my 38th year in this world. But we live in a moment that compels us each to act. The forces changing our country today are tectonic. Forces that help to explain what made this current presidency even possible. That's why this time it's not just about winning an election. It's about winning an era. If America today feels like a confusing place to live, it's because we're on one of those blank pages in between chapters. Change is coming, ready or not. The question of our time is whether families and workers will be defeated by the changes beneath us, or whether we will master them and make them work toward a better everyday life for us all. And a moment like that calls for hopeful and audacious voices from communities like ours. And yes, it calls for a new generation of leadership in this country.
Well written, well delivered. He's the right one for that message that he's sending.
Well, and Liz Smith, who's running his campaign, actually let people know when they were asking who wrote the speech. She said, "We don't have speech writers." That was Mayor Pete who wrote the speech. There were so many echoes of the Kennedys, of JFK and RFK there, and I'm not just talking about the obvious one in the new generation of leadership, but he sounded like Bobby when he talked about living in a time that compels each of us to act, or almost a JFK, sort of a ring of JFK when
optimism, youth.
Well, optimism and youth,
new life.
But also saying this isn't about winning an election. This is about winning an era. And Adrian, you really did get the sense that this was a guy talking about a torch being passed to a new generation. And I'll just ask you the response you got, because I will tell you again, Mika, when she was 9 years old, she was going to the White House. I'd been in politics for 25, 30 years. People call me all the time when they have a political comment. I must say, other than Barack Obama running in 2008, and I remember as a kid Ronald Reagan in 1980, I never really got flooded with a type of phone calls and heard the excitement that I heard yesterday afternoon from Republicans, independents, and Democrats.
Yeah, same here, Joe. Between Mayor Pete's speech and the Masters, my phone was blowing up yesterday afternoon, too. And here's the thing. I mean, here's a guy who represents the next generation of Democrats who is in a red state, giving a speech talking about how mayors are executives, which I think is a very important message that he delivered. He reminded people that, sure, I'm the mayor of a medium-sized town and I'm young, but I too can be president of the United States, and here's my vision. So I think representing mayors in that context is very important. And secondly, this is a region that we do need to win back as Democrats. You know, we may not win Indiana back this time in 2020, but we need to start rebuilding the Democratic Party in this region of the country. So it was very inspiring to see this. The question now becomes, where does he go next? How does he channel this enthusiasm and excitement into a real full-fledged campaign? And I think we're seeing that take shape at this moment.
Well, and that is, Jonathan, from Jonathan Lemire, from the excitement of yesterday. The question is, can he scale this operation? All presidential operations, as a friend reminded me yesterday, they have to be scaled, and they have to be scaled quickly. A more important question for Mayor Pete is this. Yes, you can win Iowa, and yes, you can win New Hampshire, overwhelmingly white electorates. But you can't win by exciting educated white people in the Democratic Party. You have to have a more diverse coalition. And the question is, how will he fare in South Carolina? How will he fare in California? How will he fare among Hispanics and black voters and other Americans?
You're right, and we shouldn't lose sight of just what a remarkable rise this has been and how sudden it's been. That 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago, no one knew who this person was. No one knew about this mayor outside of some very limited pockets in Democratic circles. And he has proven himself. He's been called up from the minor leagues. I mean, he has earned his spot on the big stage. He has proven adept at fundraising, and that's part of going to go to answer your question there, Joe. Is he's going to have the money to stay in this, to have a campaign, to be able to get to those states. He has been very smart about saying yes to every media opportunity, and he's really sort of gotten himself out there. He's proven himself to be witty and charming and human and compassionate. He is someone who is resonating with a lot of people. And I know the Kennedy themes are there correctly, the comparisons you drew yesterday, but I was also struck by his repeated use of the word audacity. He was clearly trying to link himself to Barack Obama as well. There were themes there, very similar notions. Obama in 2007, let's remember, freshman senator, someone who of course gave the famous speech in the 2004 convention, but was still really an unknown to a lot of people. And he recognized that some of his critics would think, hey, you're doing this too early, you're doing this too soon, you're not ready. And Mayor Pete sort of took that head on yesterday and made a similar comparison, a similar statement saying that, yes, a lot of people out there think I'm too young, or I don't look like, or I don't fit the bill, I don't have the resume of what a president should look like, but America is changing, so why can't this be me? And yes, he's got a long way to go. We're in the early stages. He is gonna have to speak to minority voters. That crowd in South Bend yesterday, mostly made up of white faces. You know, he has some issues, some civil rights issues, policing issues in his hometown that he is going to have to address in the weeks and months go forward as the nation gets to know him better. But it was a remarkable first step yesterday.
So, Mika, Jonathan brought up a really important point about the sudden rise of Mayor Pete, and that is making himself available. What we told candidates time and again, we saw it with Mike Huckabee in 2008, when Mike Huckabee always made himself available, shocked the political world with his win in Iowa in 2008 without a campaign staff, much of a campaign staff to speak of, and of course Donald Trump in 2016. Trump always made himself available. People complained bitterly about the fact that he was always on TV, that he was on this show all the time, that he was on CNN all the time, that he was on Fox all the time. Guess what? He made himself available. It was like cracking the code to Fort Knox to get most of the other candidates on the show. We, in fact, offered other candidates the ability to come on the show anytime they wanted to call in, and they were too afraid. Mayor Pete is not afraid. He's everywhere. In fact, Dr. Dave went to South Bend, Indiana last week. We've got a package coming up.
Spent hours and hours and hours
together.
New
Hampshire, I'm sorry. Went to New Hampshire, spent hours with him, came on our show for 30 minutes. That goes a long way. Introduce yourself to the American people. And if you or your campaign staff, if they're scared to do that, well, you don't deserve to be president of the United States, and you won't be president of the United States if you can't get yourself out there in more than these safeguarded 4-minute interviews.
Yeah, and Eddie Glaude, and I'd love to have a follow-up answer from Adrian on this, but looking at where leaders come from, just where we are at this moment in time, which is very early, I sort of feel like this Kennedy concept, this young, new millennial candidate concept in Beto, which I would love for him to come on the show to understand exactly what he's about and ask him some real questions. But I feel like that concept has been forced on me. I'm not comfortable. Like, don't tell me who, that this candidate is the one. And you hear about all these Democratic operatives flocking to Beto. And you feel this sort of contrived candidacy. And then you look at Mayor Pete, who has literally come out of nowhere, and it feels much more natural. It feels real. You hear him, and he touches you. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I said on this show, I believe that it will be an interesting conversation when Beto has to hold his own against someone like Mayor Pete with regards to the millennials in terms of substance
Right.
and the like. I think yesterday when you listened to Mayor Pete, I heard two things. One, I heard a politician of the interregnum, that politician that sits in this space between a dying world and a world that's trying to be born. Someone who's giving voice to that period of transition. And then the second thing I heard was that Mayor Pete was reaching for a new consensus story. When we talk about Make America Great Again, Joe and Mika, what we're really talking about is a period in what American historians call where there was a consensus narrative, a story that linked us all. But it really didn't link us all. It was a story about white men. It was a story about a certain understanding of America that turned its face away from all of this ugliness. But what Mayor Pete suggested is that there's another way to tell a story of America that included not only him, but all of us, that included all of those who have been on the margins. And so he laid out, I think he put forward the outlines of a new consensus story. But now it's time to join it with substantive policy. Now we get the message, we get the flying rhetoric. Now let's start seeing what is your position on Medicare? What is your position with regards to the living wage? What is your position with regards to criminal justice? Let's add content. He just can't be slogan. We had enough of that with Hope and Change.
So, Adrian, add to that, does the Democratic establishment see this candidate? One could argue that they missed the mark last time around, and they didn't see what was happening in front of them. That's probably putting it kindly. Do they see this candidate?
You know, they do. And Mika, I got to tell you, I have talked to a number of operatives, former colleagues of mine over the past few days who have said, you know what, I actually am interested in going out and trying to work for Mayor Pete. So I think you're starting to see more of a transition from, sort of this, fringe candidacy, we'll see if it goes anywhere, to this guy's the real deal. I'm inspired by him. I think we can make this movement into something that actually is a full-fledged, real campaign where he can pick up delegates in key states, which of course that is crucial, right? Like you can be popular, you can be somebody that inspires people, but if you can't win delegates in some of these early states, you can't really go anywhere. You can't go further. So I think you're starting to see more people seeing that. And pertaining to Beto, I do think that Beto in many respects has more to lose here, right? He narrowly lost to Ted Cruz in a very red state, which of course is transitioning more into a purple state in Texas. But I think for somebody like him, he, came onto the scene kind of out of nowhere, and now he's got all of this intense pressure to stay in the top 3 or 4, whereas Mayor Pete's kind of like, you know what, I don't have a whole lot to lose, and that affords you a lot more opportunity to make, potentially make some risks and to develop a message that is more, more in line with what you want to say. There were times where a mayor from a medium-sized town could not run for president. He is proving that is not the case, and he's inspiring a lot of people along the way.
Well, again, as the mirror image of Donald Trump in so many ways, Adrian just said it. Mayor Pete has nothing to lose. Who does that sound like? It sounds an awful lot like Donald Trump 4 years ago when he staked out a lot of bold positions, I would say reckless and irresponsible positions, but still, he felt like he had nothing to lose, and you could see it on the campaign trail every day. You sense that again with Mayor Pete, who again will get out there, go on interviews, take interviews, He's not afraid. He's bold, he's audacious, and he's not afraid for Americans to see who he is.
And he's got the smarts, that's for sure.
And the abilities. Let's go to Chicago right now and talk to NBC News' Josh Lederman. And Josh, we're talking a lot about people on phones outside of South Bend, Indiana, outside that old Studebaker plant, telling us what they saw inside. You were actually inside. Tell us what you saw.
Well, it was pouring all day long yesterday in South Bend, Joe, and they had to move it into a old car factory instead of the outside event that they had intended. But the roof basically was not solid, and so the rain was coming down on these 4,500 people who were shoved into this factory for hours. And I have to tell you, nobody seemed to mind. They were all just enthused. They were revved up. We talked to a lot of them who said that they've already made up their minds. You know, this is someone they hadn't known even existed a few weeks ago, but a few instances of hearing him talk, hearing the values that he's trying to bring to the table, they were pretty much sold. And, you know, you're right, it was a very white crowd, more diverse in terms of age than it was in terms of other factors. And that is certainly something that I think Buttigieg is going to have to really work on, particularly given some of the cross currents of the Democratic primary right now, but he certainly had a lot of enthusiasm and folks who seemed like they were taking from him something that they were not seeing in any other Democratic candidate in this field.
All right, we're going to have much more on Mayor Pete's announcement throughout the show. We're going to bring in the Washington Post's Robert Costa, who is in South Bend this morning. And as Joe mentioned, Dr. Dave Campbell kicks off our candidate checkup series with his exclusive interview with Mayor Pete. Also still ahead on Morning Joe, there's another history-making event on tap this week. Bob Mueller's report goes public. We'll get a preview of that just ahead. Plus, the White House says Congress isn't smart enough to look through the president's tax returns. Does it also hold the American people in such low regard? That conversation and much more is coming up on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.